Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about world affairs and the people who shape it. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch, and in this show we discuss topical global issues and have in-depth conversations with personalities in foreign policy. Global Dispatches is presented in partnership with Humanity in Action, an international educational organization, and I am a Humanity in Action Senior Fellow. A few weeks ago, I was having lunch with a former high-ranking U.S. diplomat whose work focused on Russia and Europe. I asked him where he thought Putin might target next to sow instability, and without missing a beat, he said Bosnia. So I did a little digging myself, and indeed there have been a number of think tank and press reports about Russian meddling in Bosnia. It's an extremely undercovered global story, but one that has the potential to cause unrest not only in the Balkans, but across Europe. On the line with me to discuss this situation is Michael Carpenter. He's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Eastern Europe, and the Balkans, and is now Senior Director for Diplomacy and Global Engagement at the Penn Biden Center. Michael explains some of the motivations driving Vladimir Putin here. Above all, he describes how fomenting unrest in Bosnia is Putin's best insurance policy against perceived threats by the West. Bosnia, as Michael puts it, is the soft underbelly of Europe that is ripe for exploitation. Before we dive into this episode, though, I thought it would be helpful to give a quick history lesson here, and we get into this in more detail in the episode. But in brief, the country that I refer to shorthand as Bosnia, its name is actually Bosnia-Herzegovina. It was created by the 1995 Dayton Peace Accords, which ended the civil war in the former Yugoslavia. The country of Bosnia-Herzegovina is composed of two main entities. The first entity, rather confusingly, is called the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is mainly Bosniak and Croat. The other is called the Republika Srpska, which is majority Serb. And together, again, these two entities form the country that I refer to as Bosnia, that's formerly known as Bosnia and Herzegovina. And again, we get into more detail about this unique and somewhat bizarre political arrangement in the episode, but I thought just that background would be helpful for you to have if you didn't already have it as we kick off this conversation. As always, I want to encourage you to get in touch with me with your suggestions of topics I should cover or people I should interview. You can hit me up at Mark L. Goldberg on Twitter, or better yet, send me an email using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. I love hearing from you. If you have anything else on your mind, questions that you think I might be able to answer, please send them my way. And again, thank you all who are leaving reviews of the show on iTunes. If you do leave a review, let me know, and I will mail you one of our brand new Global Dispatches podcast stickers. I still have a few left, so leave a review and I will put it in the mail for you. All right, now here is my conversation with Michael Carpenter of the Penn Biden Center.
Well, I think that we should be alarmed because Russian influence in Republika Srpska has been mounting now for several years. And so the military buildup is just sort of the outward manifestation of that. But the political influence is what's really something that people should be concerned about.
So what are some manifestations of those political influences?
Well, we've seen that the current president of the Republika Srpska entity within Bosnia and Herzegovina, Milorad Dodik, is heavily under the influence of Moscow. He will deny that. He will say that he has friendly relations with Moscow. But we've seen that over the course of really the last 3, 4, 5 years, his relationship with Belgrade has been weakened, although it's still relatively strong. And his relationship with Moscow has been vastly strengthened. And he really depends on Moscow and on Russia as a source of patronage, of assistance. But also, on the military side, we've seen Russia not only training the Republika Srpska police, which is the police force in the entity of Republika Srpska, not in the larger country of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then now these reports of Russian training for mercenaries that would sort of act as a Praetorian guard to Dodik and to his regime in Banja Luka. And, that's dangerous because ethnic tensions are lurking right below the surface. And Dodik has been increasingly emboldened in putting forward secessionist claims and using secessionist rhetoric to galvanize his political base. And in fact, he said that 2018, he said in the past at least, that 2018 is the year that he might call a referendum on the secession of Republika Srpska from the rest of Bosnia. Obviously, that is a very troubling development if it happens, because it is a tinderbox there still, and it could result in conflicts that could ignite beyond Bosnia into the wider region.
And that's like the ultimate card that Dodik could play, presumably at the behest of Putin, is calling for this referendum, which would be terribly destabilizing throughout the region. And now, there are all these reports of Dodik sort of arming up and having his police force and all these paramilitaries receive arms and perhaps some training from Russia, that they would be sort of armed and able to sort of perhaps enforce this independence.
So, a couple things on this. I don't think that Dodik will make any moves without Moscow's acquiescence. They are his primary backers. And from the Kremlin's perspective, they are satisfied with the status quo. They don't want Bosnia and Herzegovina to enter either the EU or, God forbid, from their perspective, NATO. And so they like the status quo because essentially Republika Srpska has a veto over the country's geopolitical direction. Ostensibly, Sarajevo is still pursuing EU and NATO membership, but in reality, Euro-Atlantic aspirations have been thwarted. And so my personal belief is that Putin will not allow Dodik to pursue a secession referendum for now. However, if Russia feels that its back is up against the wall, that European sanctions, for example, are being increased, perhaps in a totally different context of Ukraine or something else, he has Bosnia and Herzegovina always readily available as a sort of the soft underbelly of Europe, where he can just press a button and really destabilize the situation in the wider region. And that's what's worrisome. The military buildup, I don't see it so much as designed to enforce separation of Bosnia, although that's certainly a possibility. But it's more to protect the regime against internal opponents of Dodik's. And so it's sort of, again, as I said, it's creating a Praetorian Guard that will protect Dodik from potential challengers within Serbia. One of those challengers, or at least one of his, challenger is the wrong word, but one of his political rivals is Mladen Ivanic, who is a member of the Bosnian Tri-Presidency, and he is therefore based in Sarajevo, who's very moderate and pragmatic and reasonable, and I think supports Bosnia's Euro-Atlantic trajectory. He sees the future of Bosnia as part of Europe, and therefore is at odds with Dodik. And Dodik wants to eliminate those sorts of political rivals.
Okay, so the person you just mentioned is also from Republika Srpska, but is a member of the presidency. And we'll talk a little bit about the sort of bizarre political makeup of Bosnia and Herzegovina in a second. But I just wanted to emphasize one point you made, which I think is important and something worth exploring. So basically, you're saying that igniting tension in Republika Srpska and Bosnia more broadly is pretty easy for Putin to do if he wanted to do it. And this is sort of his ultimate trump card to get back at Europe if they act too aggressively towards him as he might perceive it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very vulnerable spot in Europe, and Europe is anyway more and more vulnerable because of the rise of nationalist populist movements across the continent. But, I mean, nationalist populism has a strong home in the Western Balkans, and particularly in Bosnia. And so if you want to exploit that, this is the place where you can do it and have an influence on the rest of Europe. This is, Bosnia sits in the heart of Europe. Any refugee flows, God forbid, should there be a renewed conflict, would impact Europe. So that's why it's so important for U.S. and especially European policymakers to pay more attention to Bosnia, because frankly, over the course of the last decade or so, the eyes have been taken off of what's happening in Bosnia, and people have sort of assumed that, the situation has stabilized, that the country is on this sort of linear trajectory that will eventually result in Euro-Atlantic integration. That's a very naive belief because although there has been stability over the last decade, that stability sort of belies a lot of churn and a lot of both political animosities, but also, as I said, latent ethnic tensions that are left over from the 90s, and that's dangerous.
So let's go back a little bit. I was hoping maybe you can walk me through a little bit of a history lesson. So the entity we know of now as Bosnia and Herzegovina was created in the wake of the 1995 Dayton Peace Accord, which ended the civil war in the former Yugoslavia. Created two entities, Republika Srpska and the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is different from the country we know as Bosnia and Herzegovina. What's the relationship between, say, Republika Srpska and the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Well, it is a little bit like the relationship between Catalonia and Spain, or between Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom.
So perfectly harmonious, then.
Only worse.
Yeah.
So, Bosnia is one of the most convoluted political systems on the planet. As you mentioned, the two basic units are the Federation and Republika Srpska. Republika Srpska is the primarily ethnic Serb entity, which is controlled, as I said, by its local president, Milorad Dodik, and the Federation encompasses both the Bosniak Muslim as well as the Croatian populated parts of Bosnia, although the whole country has been historically a patchwork, and so it was never easy to divide the region along ethnic lines, but Dayton, essentially the Dayton Peace Accord, did do that, and it created those two entities. Then there's also 10 cantons, and it gets much more complicated than that, but we don't need to go into that. I think what's important is that Republika Srpska is trying to pull apart from the rest of the country, and that also has follow-on repercussions because the head of the ethnic Croatian entity, or the representative of ethnic Croatians in Bosnia, is a man named Dragan Čović. He's a member of the Tri-Presidency. Again, the presidency has three representatives, one from each predominant ethnic group, Muslims, or Bosniaks as they're called, Croats and Serbs. And Čović also wants to carve out a third entity, what's called a third entity, for the Croat population of Bosnia. So if Republika Srpska ever separated from the rest of Bosnia, it would create an internal dynamic most likely within the federation that would also lead to the division of, potentially at least, the Muslim and Croat parts of the country. So it really is a tinderbox. It really is something that's being held together by very thin glue, and it's very brittle as a sort of a political institution.
Well, let me ask then, if it is so brittle as a political institution, and if Dayton, it turns out was really, a good way to end a war, but not a good way to build a country in its wake, why not let Republika Srpska secede and form its own autonomous state, and then have the Croatian entity form its own sort of mini state as well? What's the argument against that?
Well, it is very dangerous to allow countries in this day and age to break apart based on ethno-national arguments. As I mentioned, Bosnia and Herzegovina has always been a very complex patchwork of ethnicities, and having Republika Srpska separate from the rest of Bosnia and Herzegovina would then imperil those, for example, Muslim Bosniaks who live in Republika Srpska and who currently feel that they have this overarching government of Bosnia that protects their minority rights, and by the way, which are guaranteed also by the Dayton Peace Accords. And they would essentially be left to fend for themselves. Those populations would be put at risk in a independent Republika Srpska. It would potentially have follow-on effects in the wider Western Balkans region. There's a lot of countries that have mixed ethnicities, and this would set a terrible precedent for them. And as I said, it would set also a terrible precedent for the rump part of Bosnia, should this ever come to pass, the federation, which would also be very, very conflict prone. And so it's just a bad idea. There's the city of Brčko, which is in the northern and eastern part of the country, which again is part of Republika Srpska, but has its own sort of status. That would uneasily sit within Republika Srpska, and so it's just very messy. There's no easy way to do this. Is the bottom line.
Well, I'm wondering, what are some potential worst case scenarios? It seems plausible, not out of the realm of possibility that this becomes like the next Ukraine, in the sense that you have, heavily Russian interference, you have armed conflict.
Well, I think that's actually not quite the right analogy. I think, the worst case scenario, and I don't want to sound too alarmist here, but, it is worth, raising this issue because it's a very, very serious one with potentially huge ramifications. But the scenario for Bosnia is really Bosnia. I mean, the most likely scenario is a return to the Bosnian War of the 1990s. And that would really be catastrophic for the country, for the people who live there, and for Europe. Russia, the role that Russia plays, or the Kremlin, is potentially to ignite and exacerbate ethnic tensions there, just as they do, by the way, in the United States, and they do in France, and they do in other countries, with online propaganda, with well-funded influence operations, and so on and so forth. But so Russia is more akin to the great power interfering in Bosnian politics and igniting the spark, but it doesn't need to play an active role with its own military the way it is currently in Ukraine. I mean, currently in Ukraine, you've got about 2,000 to 3,000 regular Russian troops that have complete command and control over the proxy forces there and are prosecuting a hot war against Ukraine, against the state of Ukraine. In Bosnia, you wouldn't necessarily have a deployment of Russian troops. You would have Russia, again, instigating a conflict sort of covertly from behind the scenes, and then watching it as the flames are fanned just simply by local tensions and local animosities.
To what extent?
But that doesn't, doesn't mean this is going to pass. I want your listeners to understand. I don't. It sounds very alarmist, and we should take it seriously. But by no means this scenario will necessarily play out in this way.
I'm wondering to what extent Russia's decision making here is guided in part by what happened last year when Montenegro was admitted to NATO. What was it, last April or so? Last June, Montenegro, another part of the former Yugoslavia, joined NATO last year, which seemed to seriously upset Putin personally. It seemed he took it.
Well, Russia has always wanted to defend what it considers its sphere of privileged interests, to use former President, current Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev's phrase. And what's important for people to understand is the sphere of privileged interests for the Kremlin doesn't just mean the countries on Russia's periphery. It means the countries where Russian oligarchs and cronies of Putin's have business interests. It's wherever their fingers are in the rice bowl, so to speak. And Montenegro was a place where a lot of Russians had invested in the 90s after the dissolution of Yugoslavia into the 2000s. And when Montenegro declared independence in 2006 and the political leadership of the country decided to pursue European and NATO integration, that was opposed by the Kremlin. But it was only when they started to get serious about it and actually undertake reforms that threatened Russia's interests, because, again, Russia's interests are intimately tied up with organized crime and corruption and these sorts of activities, then the Kremlin really started to push back. And yes, in October of 2016, the Russian military intelligence service, the GRU, planned a coup d'etat against the sitting prime minister. It was supposed to happen on election day. They recruited mercenaries from within the region, from Kosovo, from Serbia, and from Montenegro itself to carry it out. And luckily, one of the hired mercenaries tipped off the authorities and became a cooperating government witness, and so the authorities were able to foil the plot in advance, and it never was carried out. But talk about a brazen intervention in a sovereign country. Russia really had a coup d'état all lined up to happen.
I think that just sort of goes to show the extent to which Russia is so opposed to, obviously, NATO expansion and, countries in its periphery looking closer towards the EU and integration. I guess I'm wondering, how close, where is Bosnia and Herzegovina in talks to, in particular with European integration with the EU? Are they in sort of the early steps? Are they in the process?
So they're in the process with both NATO and the EU, but as I said, they're effectively hamstrung from any substantive advancement on either track, on either EU or the NATO track. And that's because Republika Srpska, the entity, basically has a de facto veto over their progress. So, for example, in NATO, in 2014, there was something called the Tallinn conditions based on a meeting that was held in the Estonian capital of Tallinn that were imposed on Bosnia, whereby NATO decided that that Bosnia needed to register all of its defense properties across the entire country so that the Ministry of Defense would be accountable and would use them in line with NATO accession goals. And essentially, Republika Srpska has refused to register properties that fall on its territory. And so the Tallinn conditions have de facto given Banja Luka and Dodik a veto over Bosnia's membership action plan, which is what it needs to be able to move forward with its NATO accession. And a similar process, not quite as explicit and institutionalized, but a similar process is underway with its EU integration, whereby if Republika Srpska fails to implement the conditions for further progress towards the EU, the country is just simply going to stagnate under the status quo. And that's what's happening, unfortunately.
Finally, it's my understanding that there are to be elections in October. What should we be looking out for in those elections? How are you approaching the elections? What are you looking forward to? What are you looking to? How are you approaching? How are you understanding them?
Well, the elections will be based in large measure on patronage and clientelism, which is what sort of dominates Bosnia's politics. But what I am most worried about, and that's existed for decades. What I'm most worried about is not the patronage politics, but the use of xenophobic rhetoric to mobilize a nationalist base, particularly in Republika Srpska, but also, frankly, in the Federation. We didn't talk about the influence of Middle Eastern countries like Iran, Turkey, but there's a lot of foreign powers that are meddling in Bosnian politics, and it's a pretty toxic brew. And if you have politicians appealing on narrowly xenophobic or nationalistic lines to appeal to a certain segment of the population that is wanting that type of rhetoric or susceptible to it, it just makes for a very dangerous situation. Now, of course, Bosnia's had lots of elections in the last decade, and so these are just another one. It doesn't mean that again, the country is about to implode, but it does mean that we need to watch carefully. And I think the number one sort of takeaway for your listeners is that we've really done ourselves a disservice in Brussels and Washington by taking our eyes off of Bosnia. And the country needs a lot more Western attention. It needs a lot more support. It also needs more incentives, more structured incentives to make reforms that will take away some of these vulnerabilities that I just mentioned.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. This is very helpful. Obviously, it's a complex situation, but one in which I think you're right. We ought to be paying a bit more attention to.
Happy to be with you. Thanks.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you so much to Michael. That was very helpful. It's again one of those situations that I think is a sort of pre-crisis situation. It's something that could be ignited seemingly at any moment and boil to the surface very, very quickly. So I was glad to give you the context for understanding this news if and when it comes. Again, feel free to reach out to me using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. I love hearing from you. I really do mean that. I do this show for you. So when you reach out to me with your questions or your comments, I really do value that interaction. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.
The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of Humanity in Action.